when you look at Notre Dame, they have been more dominant and consistent than the teams that sit right behind them. Yes, I agree. It's weird to have a 2-loss team that lost to another 2-loss team sitting 8 spots in front of them. But tell me who has been more consistent in their performance over the last month of the season. Has it been Notre Dame, Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, or Virginia? Hello and welcome in. It's always college football. I'm your host, Greg McElroy, and we are glad to have you with us here tonight, tomorrow, whatever day you are absorbing this conversation. This is our college football playoff rankings release show number 1. We just got the college football playoff committee rankings. As you can see, I was literally, as I'm starting the show, I'm undoing my tie. It was a great show and entertaining show and a lot that we need to break down. And unfortunately, when we're on the desk with the outstanding Joey Galloway, Booger McFarland, and Reese Davis, we don't get to necessarily go into the weeds on a lot of these breakdowns. That's what this is for. That's why we have our always college football post rankings release show. And we also this year are doing things a little differently. We actually are submitting or having a lot of our listeners submit questions about what they learned, what they liked, what they didn't like. And that, I think, will hopefully make things pretty fun and interactive. So far, there's a lot to take away. We learned quite a bit about what this committee is all about. We also are going to tell you about who's on the committee and why I think it makes sense this year. For those of y'all that are new to the show, go ahead and join the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, rate the podcast, whatever you feel like doing. That's fine as well. Good with all of that. The other thing I would say too, if you're joining us for the very first time post rankings release, y'all know that I am usually pretty upset with what we get from the college football playoff committee. If you want me to be honest, I usually am very, very frustrated. I'm very angry because I feel like the committee oftentimes will just put names and numbers up and teams up, and then there's not a lot of thought process. There's all these contradictions. There's all these issues. There's all these things like, why'd they do that? It didn't make sense. I actually think this year's initial rankings pretty good. Few things I disagree with, and we'll go through them here in a moment. But for the most part, they did an adequate job. So let's kick things off and let's dive in. Let's go through the rankings 1 through 25, tell you what they got right, what they got wrong, and how they can maybe tweak it here in the weeks to come. Okay, so the first thing we got to talk about is the actual committee itself, because I feel like for a long time, the people that were on the committee served in an administrative role. They were ADs. They had responsibilities on Saturday to their university or to their employer. So it was challenging to ask them to not just commit all their energy and attention into their running a program, running an athletic department, but also having to watch all these games and having to micromanage who's watching what and who's doing this. And I got to travel to Dallas and I got to go watch this game and I got this team. I have this assignment and I have to also learn all these metrics. To me, I felt like we had kind of missed the boat by not having more former players, former coaches, retired coaches being a part of the committee. I think the balance that they found this year is actually fantastic. I really like it. I like that you have 4 football players or coaches with Chris Alt, who's in the College Football Hall of Fame. Of course, did an amazing job at the University of Nevada. You got Mark D'Antonio, who was there from Michigan State, of course, was there for a very long time. You got Mike Riley, who's been a coach for 5 decades. You also have Wesley Walls, who provides a bit of a player's perspective. He played at Ole Miss and, of course, went on to have a tremendous NFL career. And then you have all the administrators like they always have. So I appreciate very much that there's a real balance, I feel like, between the administration side, the media side, and then, of course, the player side, former coaches side as well. So the balance this year makes a lot of sense. So with all that being said, let's dive into the actual rankings themselves. I have it right here. If you want to see my notes for this, it's right here. Right here. Ready? Okay, let's start at number 1, Ohio State. Some people had a problem with this. I didn't. And part of the reason why I didn't have an issue with this is because I've watched Ohio State play. I've seen the level of dominance. I've seen the actual performance improve. And I feel like the committee, and we'll get into this with a few teams here in a minute, this is a team that I feel like has improved drastically from what we saw week 1. Ohio State was a solid football team week 1 in beating Texas. Texas is currently ranked in the top 11. That's their best win on paper. But what we saw from Ohio State that day, today's version of Ohio State would beat that version of Ohio State by 21 points. I'm convinced of that. So I've seen progress made at quarterback. I've seen progress made in identity. I think the defense has been steady all throughout. But I've just really been impressed with the growth that I've seen from Ohio State. If you look at their metrics, they're outstanding. They're number one in game control, which is a real fancy way of saying eye test. They're number three in strength of record. And while strength of schedule sits at 33, they have 2 wins right now against teams that are ranked in the top 25. Those 2 teams combined to score a grand total of 13 points against the Buckeyes. I think they're appropriately ranked at number 1. And number 2 is Indiana. If you want a team that I might least like to play, Indiana would certainly be at the top of the list. I also look at the win against Oregon, going on the road and doing it there, going on the road and beating number 20 Iowa. We'll talk about Iowa in a little bit. They might be one of the teams that we have a slight bone to pick. Indiana, I'm good with. But Joey, who sat to my right, and I love Joey, he was kind of jumping up on the table in favor of Texas A&M. And I think Texas A&M, based on what they've accomplished, they're number 1 in strength of record. They are currently sitting at number 15 in strength of schedule. They're number 5 in game control. I've loved everything I've seen from Texas A&M. But I don't feel like the level of 4-quarter dominance that we've seen from Ohio State and Indiana, we have not seen that level of 4-quarter dominance from Texas A&M. Yes, the second half of the LSU game, if I got that every week, I'd be totally good with them being ranked number 1. If I saw the level of resilience displayed at Notre Dame, phenomenal win. Notre Dame currently ranks in the top 10, one of the best wins of the season, by the way. I think that's great. I think that A&M is terrific. I think they should be 3. The committee put them there. I completely agree with it. At number 4 is Alabama. Highest ranked 1-loss team. Shouldn't come as a huge surprise when you take into account that they beat the team sitting right behind them in Georgia. They also beat a Vanderbilt team that's still ranked in the top 16. They also have beaten a Missouri team that's still ranked in the top 22. So if you look at what Alabama has accomplished, for them to still be ranked 4th, I'm not sure there's a lot of people pushing back on their current candidacy sitting where they're at. They also have a win against Tennessee. So 4 wins against teams that are currently ranked in the committee's top 25. Bama needs no explanation, nor do they need no justification either. Georgia sits at 5. Good with that. They have a win over Ole Miss. Ole Miss sits right behind them. One of the things I was very curious about was, where would Ole Miss be relative to Oregon? Because if you look at Ole Miss and Oregon, I feel like they're very, very similar. One, Oregon, on their home field, lost to the team that's currently ranked 2nd. Ole Miss lost on the road to a team that's currently ranked 5th. I kind of feel like those are somewhat similar in the way they lost the game. There were opportunities for Oregon to win that game. They squandered them. There were opportunities for Ole Miss to win that game at Georgia. They squandered them. They actually had a 9-point lead going into the 4th quarter. So things were looking very good for Ole Miss. They just couldn't manufacture it. So I was really curious to see how the committee would value those 2 teams. Well, there's Ole Miss sitting at 6, Oregon sitting at 9. That says an awful lot. I have been kind of pounding the table saying I'm not there yet with Oregon. I think their ceiling's absurd. I think their potential is ridiculous. But I can't justify having them sitting up there in front of even a BYU or a Texas Tech right now, based on who they've played and what they've accomplished. Their best win is currently against a 5-3 Northwestern team. So that's, I'm sure, something that a lot of people are really frustrated with, is where Oregon currently resides. Well, when you look at what Oregon has coming up on the schedule, still have a home tilt against USC. USC is currently ranked in the top 19. Still have a road trip to Washington. They're sitting at 23. They have a road trip at Iowa this week. They're sitting at 20. Oregon's perfectly fine. But here's the scary thing if you're an Oregon Duck fan. There's no guarantee that with a second loss in any of those 3 games that I just listed, there's no guarantee that you're going to be in the college football playoff. Now, you need SC to hold up their end of the bargain. You need Washington to hold up their end of the bargain. And I think if you lose to Iowa, that's going to be a tough one for the committee to get over, potentially, especially if you lose at home, by the way, to SC. If you lose at home again for the second time this season, will that potentially factor in as well? So I think that's the team right now who's sitting there with 1 loss. You'd think they'd be in good shape, even if they lost the second game. I don't know if it's a foregone conclusion. For Oregon, a team that's currently in the top 10, another loss could drop them down considerably, might even drop them down behind one of the 4 mentioned teams that I just talked about. BYU at 7, Texas Tech at 8. We'll group those 2 together. I think it's A little bit with BYU. Very impressed. Undefeated. Got to give them credit. The win against Utah continues to hold up. Utah, one of the big surprises, by the way, sitting at 13. A little higher than I anticipated, but understandable to an extent as well. So Utah is sitting there undefeated, or excuse me, BYU sitting there undefeated with a quality win against Utah. You got to give great credit for that. They have Texas Tech. Texas Tech, their one loss was without their quarterback. I do think the committee is factoring that in. Going on the road to Arizona State, a team that's not ranked in the top 25, but without your quarterback, that's a tall order. And the committee did not penalize Texas Tech because of that. And if you look at Texas Tech, they do have a consistent performance defensively. They also have a complete beatdown at the hands, a complete beatdown of the Oregon Ducks. Or, excuse me, a complete beatdown. Excuse me, I'm tired, guys. The complete beatdown of the Utah Utes there in Salt Lake earlier in the season. So that's something to factor in as well. I think 7-8 make perfect sense. Notre Dame is a big point of contention for many. And understandable, right? Notre Dame currently sits 8 spots in front of Miami, who beat them head-to-head in week 1, right? That's a hard thing for a lot of people to wrap their head around. I completely get it. Is Notre Dame ranked a little too high? Probably. Should Notre Dame probably be 13th, 14th, potentially? But answer me this. Notre Dame lost 2 games, right? To Miami and to Texas A&M. We know Miami's not as good as they once were. We know A&M is very much legit. They lost those games close, correct? I have never been a guy, ever, not one time in my entire career have I ever said, you know what, close losses matter. To this committee, they might. Because Notre Dame is not the only one that is being propped up. And maybe those losses that were close, they're being somewhat forgiven. I do think Notre Dame is benefiting from that. Yeah, they lost the game. Yep, both those games were very, very close. We'll give Notre Dame extra credit for being competitive in those 2 losses. I'll explain how that might factor in again here in just a minute when I get to team number 20. When you look at Notre Dame, they have been more dominant and consistent than the teams that sit right behind them. Yes, I agree. It's weird to have a 2-loss team that lost to another 2-loss team sitting 8 spots in front of them. But tell me who has been more consistent in their performance over the last month of the season. Has it been Notre Dame, Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, or Virginia? Those are the 5 teams sitting right there in a grouping between 10 and 14. Who's been the most consistent over the last 5 or 6 weeks in that small group? It's Notre Dame. Texas, I think Texas has a real high ceiling. Texas has a nice win against Vanderbilt. Texas has a close loss to Ohio State. Clearly, close losses factoring in here, especially on the road in week 1. I'm sure, according to the committee members, based on what happened with Bama and where they're ranked, the committee members probably saying, well, week 1 was forever ago, guys. We got to factor what they are today. And Notre Dame is being propped up by that. And if you look at Texas, yes, the arrow is pointing up. They have a win against Oklahoma. They have a win against Vanderbilt. Things are looking good for them. That's why they sit at 11 in front of Oklahoma and Vanderbilt 6 spots behind them. But Texas also had a very close win at Kentucky, an overtime win against Mississippi State, and some less than stellar performances between even the first 2 or 3, 4, 5, or 6 games. They lost to a Florida team. They just didn't play great for about a month. Yes, they won a couple games, but there were a handful of games in which they didn't put forth a 4-quarter performance. Oklahoma's been remarkably up and down. I mean, if you look at their performance against Auburn, for example, yes, a month ago, they were pretty fortunate to win that game on their home field. And while they've bounced back in remarkable fashion, I think if you give Oklahoma a ton of credit for being resilient and finding a way, and they have a win against a Tennessee team. They have other quality performances that they've put together. They beat a Michigan team in week 2. Oklahoma, understandably, is sitting at 12, but have they been more dominant than Notre Dame? I move on. Utah lost on their home field by 3 touchdowns to Texas Tech, a team that ranks number 8. That's a tough one for, I think, a lot of people to get over, especially if you're in the committee room, but still, Utah in a really good spot. And then Virginia has been a little up and down throughout the season as well. Yes, they win a tough game against Louisville, who sits right behind them. They win a good game at the time against Florida State. That's looking pretty good. But there's also been moments where they've been a little up and down as well. So looking at that, I think Notre Dame is kind of appropriately ranked based on where they're at today and how they're playing today and how consistent they've played for the last month. People say, well, they didn't look good against Boston College. Name a team that's looked good every week. I'll wait. Outside of Ohio State. Everyone else has had some ebbs and flows in performance, even from a quarter to quarter standpoint. So looking at that, I'm perfectly fine with where Notre Dame is ranked. We hit Texas, we hit Oklahoma, we hit Utah, we hit Virginia. Louisville, I think, is fine. They're sitting there at 15, 16 at Vanderbilt. My question with Vanderbilt, what can they do to get in to the college football playoff? They lost to Texas, so they need Texas to lose at least one more. Texas goes to Georgia, so they should be benefited there. Oklahoma goes to Bama. Oklahoma still has to play against Missouri. Oklahoma still has a tough finishing stretch of the regular season. So if they lose a game or two, maybe Vandy could slide in front of them. Then you have what goes on in the Big 12. Who knows what's going to happen with that? But they are looking really good to potentially get two teams in. ACC, we know, is going to get just one in. Virginia, Louisville, Georgia Tech, and Miami between 14 and 18. So how does Vandy get back up without having a lot of schedule strength between now and the end of the year? Well, they need Tennessee to take care of business. That means Tennessee in the final game of the season could give Vanderbilt that last win that could maybe push them over the edge. But I think Vanderbilt, this might be as high as they can go, depending on what happens right in front of them. Miami's, I think, in a really tough spot. They had a really big marquee opportunity to go and take care of business. They didn't. So they have since fumbled in two of the last three games, both literally and figuratively. Not quite fumbled, interception. But if you look at Miami, they really need help. They need Pitt to win all the way through and have Miami get to Pitt and beat Pitt to enhance their resume. But right now it's looking like, as an at-large, Miami probably doesn't have much of a path. USC, very much, I think, in control of their own destiny. They still have a couple big games on their schedule. They have Iowa at home, who sits right behind them at 20. They have to go to Oregon. They have plenty, I think, of opportunities to enhance their resume. So SC very much, I think, in the mix right now as the top Big Ten contender outside of the obvious three in Oregon, Indiana, and Ohio State. You look at Michigan, SC has the head-to-head against them. SC hosts Iowa. Iowa is the one team that I'm having a tough time with, frankly. And I like Iowa a lot. They're a very, very well-coached, well-organized football team. But how much credit are they currently getting right now for losing close to Indiana? And that's something that we just talked about a couple times with Notre Dame. We talked about it with a couple other teams that were competitive in their loss. I don't think close losses against quality competition should be a resume builder. To me, I don't align with that. Now, you get blown out by 3 touchdowns like Utah did to Texas Tech. Yes, that should absolutely weigh into the evaluation we make on your program. But when you lose close to a good team, that should not be something that we now utilize to prop you up. So the one team on the entire top 25 that I had the biggest disagreement with was probably Iowa. Now, they can take care of their own business by handling Oregon this week. They still have USC on the schedule. There's still plenty of meat on the bone for Iowa to get into the college football playoff conversation. But based on where they're starting this process of the home stretch, I think it's a little too high. Their best win right now is against a Minnesota team that I'm just not a huge fan of. Everybody else they've played and beaten has been less than stellar. So looking at Iowa, probably a little too high right now. But does it really matter? Yes, it does. It absolutely does. Because if Iowa were to say, I don't know, lose to Oregon, that strengthens Oregon's schedule more than it probably should. Does that make sense? I think Iowa, had they win this week, they should be a top 15, top 16 team at the very worst, maybe even higher than that. But should Oregon benefit from Iowa being ranked a little too high in the initial rankings? Probably shouldn't, but they might because of where Iowa finished up. Michigan sits at 21, have no problem with that. Missouri probably slightly too low at 22, but they also lost their quarterback. And we have seen in the past the committee use a quarterback injury against teams. Should they or should they not use it is up to you. I, for one, don't love using the quarterback injury or a key injury against a team's candidacy, but it's something that's been used in the past, so I'm not surprised it's going to be used right now as well. So maybe Missouri's probably in the right spot, knowing that they are without Bo Pribula from this point forward. Washington, the 2 big games they played, they scored a combined 13 points. That's a hard one for me to get over, but I'm okay with the firepower and what they could do here down the stretch. It makes things very interesting. And then Pitt at 24. Tennessee's at 25. Not a lot to add there, to be honest with you. But Pitt at 24. Why are we spending time on that one? Because right now Pitt has 2 losses. They have a true freshman quarterback that is improving. We also are fascinated by the fact that Pitt plays Notre Dame, Pitt plays Georgia Tech, and Pitt plays Miami. So there is not a team on this entire ranking list that can have more of an impact on who makes the playoff and who gets within striking distance than Pitt, because they play 3 teams that are currently ranked in front of them that are all in the mix in the ACC, with the exception of Notre Dame. But a road trip from Notre Dame to Pitt could only strengthen Notre Dame's candidacy, potentially vault them in the top 8, which would be huge. Why? Because they then get a home playoff game. So Pitt being here and potentially beating a Georgia Tech, beating a Miami, and then losing to Notre Dame could vault the Irish into home playoff consideration. So a lot of very, very important takeaways here from this first college football playoff committee ranking. But like I said at the beginning, I think they did a pretty dang good job. We usually nitpick. We usually wear them out. We usually strongly disagree with a lot of the things they had. There's minor civil disagreements here, but nothing earth-shattering. So tip of the cap to the committee. They did a pretty good job there in week 1. All right, we're bringing the boys in. You hear me shout them out after every show. This is Jack and Mark, also known as Coobs, who is a diehard Notre Dame fan. So I can only imagine were the questions that he chose. Out of all the incredible questions that y'all submitted, I'm sure he found a way to get the Irish in all of them. And then Jack, not the other Jack. This is Tennessee Jack. The other Jack is Ohio State Jack. So Jack Foster, in this case, will help us out. He's a Tennessee fan. So his team is in the top 25. Rock and roll. All right, boys, where are we going? I know we had a ton of people submit questions. And by the way, if you guys want to submit questions in the future, you can send them to our email at alwayscollegefootball@gmail.com. You can also submit them on the social media platform of your choosing, always CFB. And then you can also do some comments. If you look in the YouTube comments, we'll try to look through those as well. So, Coobs, I think we're starting with you, buddy. Where are we going?
We are going to start with Notre Dame. They are the most polarizing team in this playoffs. And we'll get to the Miami situation in a second. But I got to ask you again about Pitt, because that was fascinating. At Pitt at 24, if Notre Dame wins this week and wins next week, that gives them another ranked win. You said they could possibly move up to a home playoff game. But my question is, do they need to show that they're continued on the uprise? Or like, what if they have a couple more performances like the game against BC where they win, but it's kind of ugly? Are they safe even if they win out?
I think they're safe in the field. But the goal for Notre Dame should be to host in South Bend at this point. Like winning out, great. You're in the field. Awesome. Now I got to go into a hostile environment. I got to go to Lubbock or somewhere else. I don't know. That's going to be challenging. Let's be real. It's going to be really challenging. So if I'm looking at it through the lens of a Notre Dame fan, how do I get back to South Bend? They're in December 19th, 18th, 20th, what have you, and whatever day that was. So looking at it, I think Pitt being in the field is enormous for Notre Dame. Now, they need to be Pitt's biggest fan, because it's the last significant resume bump that Notre Dame can get with what's remaining on their schedule. They are what they are. Another thing that can be beneficial to Notre Dame is SC taking care of business down the stretch. SC has plenty of opportunities to strengthen their candidacy as a possible 4th team out of the Big Ten to make the field. But guess who has the head-to-head between SC and Notre Dame? That'd be Notre Dame. So if all of a sudden you're looking at it and we're trying to figure out, all right, who's 8, who's 9, and that's big, right? If you're 8, you're at home. If you're 9, you're away. Who's 8, who's 9? Well, SC continuing to win is only going to enhance Notre Dame's strength of schedule. And Pitt being good would be helpful as well. It gives you another quality win against a legitimate team that might actually, if Pitt wins all their games except for the Notre Dame game, they might find their way into the ACC championship game. And then you might have a win against a playoff contender and or a playoff team. So that's huge as well. Here's what's troubling for Notre Dame. How strong is the schedule for Texas down the stretch? Massive, right? They have to go to Georgia. They host Texas A&M. So 2 teams ranked in the top 5. What if Texas wins both those games? I'm not saying they will. Obviously, it's a tall order. But what if Texas wins both those games? They're going to fly by Notre Dame. right? Now, will Georgia drop below Notre Dame is a big question in that scenario. That's number one. Number two, Oklahoma, really difficult stretch, right? They still have Missouri on the schedule. They're 22, and they have a road trip to Tuscaloosa to play against Alabama off the bye on the 15th. If they beat Bama, they're probably going to fly past Notre Dame as well. So another factor in play there is that Notre Dame is comfortable right now, but if the goal is to ultimately get a college football playoff game in South Bend, they really need teams to hold serve at home in the SEC, with Bama beating Oklahoma, Georgia beating Texas, and then in that scenario, if Texas beats Texas A&M at season's end, it probably won't have a huge impact on where Notre Dame ends up in the final rankings.
All right. So what if Notre Dame beats Pitt? They're going to be out of the rankings. Miami doesn't exactly have a strong, like a notable game after that. They play Syracuse, NC State, Virginia Tech, and at Pitt. Is there any hope that Miami can climb back in, even if they win all their games?
If you're Notre Dame, you don't want them to. The last thing you want is for Notre Dame to be measured against Miami. Miami all of a sudden gets hot and starts beating people by 40, and all of a sudden the court of public opinion changes on Miami, and all of a sudden, oh man, they're peaking at the right time. Like they had some tough mid-season swoon, and now they're peaking at the right time. Oh yeah, that's right. They beat Notre Dame. So I think if you're Notre Dame, it's like, all right, we want them out of the picture. So they probably need to be rooting for Pitt, not only because they're a common opponent, they need to be rooting for Pitt to knock off Miami, but they also just need Miami removed from the conversation to begin with.
So Miami, I guess for the fans, you're giving Miami hope.
I'm not.
You're not.
No, I think Miami's in a really tough spot because there's not a big enough win remaining on their schedule that is going to vault them into the at-large conversation. So the only way I think Miami can make it in at this point, as unfortunate this might be for Miami fans, they have 2 losses in the ACC. So they need carnage in the ACC right now. Virginia is currently undefeated in the ACC. Louisville has 1 loss, but Louisville also holds the head-to-head. Georgia Tech has 1 loss. So they need Georgia Tech to lose to Pitt. They need Louisville and Virginia to lose 2 or 1. They need Louisville to lose 2, preferably. Knowing the head-to-head, you don't want that to factor in if it can't. And you need to beat Pitt at season's end, which wouldn't really have that much of an impact because Notre Dame, in that likelihood, in that scenario, they would have beaten them in that scenario as well. So I think the only way for Miami to make it based on where they started this ranking is by winning the ACC championship. And there's a pathway there, but it's probably a 5% chance given how things have gone here in the first part of the season.
All right, up to the top here. Let's say this top 4 stay chalk. They all win out. Ohio State, Indiana. Ohio State wins the Big Ten. A&M, Alabama. A&M wins the SEC. Is there any way the SEC gets the number 1 seed, or will that automatically go to the Big Ten? And do you see anybody dropping out of the top 4 if everything stays chalk in those? Are they set in stone if they win out for the buys?
I mean, I could see with what A&M has remaining on the schedule, that would require a win at Missouri this week, which would be a good win, even though a win against Missouri would potentially knock Missouri out of the top 25. That'd be a good win. They'd get a win at Texas, which would also be a really good win. So I think if Notre Dame wins out, I think A&M would have a strong argument to make to become the number 1 overall seed. But here's the problem. There's not a single game on their schedule that is better right now, according to the committee. There's not a win on their schedule potentially that's better than Ohio State's win over Indiana and or Indiana's win over Ohio State in the Big Ten championship. So that being said, no, I think it's safe to assume at this point, assuming chalk flies, that the Big Ten will have the number 1 overall seed and the SEC champion will have the number 2 overall seed.
Yeah, Greg, shifting gears here to the SEC, this is kind of similar to the Notre Dame question, just sub in Ole Miss. Say Ole Miss drops a game, whether it's to Florida or in the Egg Bowl. Do you think they're safe? Because you talked about how Texas and Oklahoma have these great opportunities to get massive road wins, and all these SEC teams could just finish 10-2. Hell, Vanderbilt, Bama, if they lose to Oklahoma, can finish 10-2. Texas with the win, Georgia with the Texas loss. So even with a loss, do you think Ole Miss is safe, or do they kind of just need to go ahead and win out here?
Safest thing, naturally, went out. I think that goes without saying. But I also look at where Ole Miss is at right now. If they were to lose convincingly, they lose badly, for example, they lose by a decisive margin, that I think would be very detrimental. But it'd be almost completely dependent on what happens behind them. If Texas wins out, I think Texas comfortably would be in front of a 2-loss Ole Miss team. Like I said, that would be operating under the assumption that Ole Miss lost to either Florida and or to Mississippi State in the Egg Bowl. So I think if Texas wins out, they would comfortably be in front of Ole Miss. I think if Oklahoma wins out, they would likely be comfortably in front of Ole Miss too in that scenario. Then it becomes about Ole Miss with 2 losses against a Notre Dame team with 2 losses. I think Ole Miss, based on what we've seen right now, and based on how much the committee has put a value on Notre Dame and how good they've looked and how improved they've looked, I think Ole Miss would probably fall behind Notre Dame as well, because the loss to a team that is under 500 or around 500 would not be good for their overall resume. The other thing that factors in big with Ole Miss is how many is the Big 12 going to get in? Because I feel pretty confident the SEC will get 3 in. Now, which 3? A&M, Bama feel pretty safe. At this point, I think Georgia, pretty safe. Knowing they still have an opportunity to play against Georgia Tech, that can only strengthen their out of conference resume, which would strengthen their overall record strength. So that's operating the assumption that they beat Georgia Tech. They lose Georgia Tech, throw it out the window, things can change in a hurry. But right now, I feel very confident the SEC will get 3 in. I feel pretty confident they'll get 4 in. I feel vaguely confident they'll get 5 in because I don't anticipate chalk flying down the stretch. I think if Ole Miss wins 2, gun to head, I think they'll be in the field. But I do think they'll have to go on the road in the first round of the college football playoff. Whereas right now, chalk flies, they should be comfortable and sitting at home and potentially holding one of those highly coveted 5 or 6 spots, which have been very fortuitous in the first round of the playoffs. So we'll see in the first iteration of the 12-team playoff. So I think a lot of it depends on what happens with Georgia in front of them, because that's obviously one of their losses. But yeah, I think they'd still be in, but that's also operating the assumption that Texas and Oklahoma will lose one more, and then the Big 12 only gets 1 team in the field, which is where I think it will ultimately end up.
Yeah, what's crazy, Greg, like say Ole Miss wins out, so they're fine. A&M goes 11-1 with that end of season loss at Texas, and those other 4 SEC teams, Bama, Texas, Georgia, Oklahoma, are all 10-2, all with great wins. You think about Bama at Georgia, Texas the same, Georgia versus an 11-1 Ole Miss, and Oklahoma at Bama. You'd have 6 SEC teams all with strong arguments to get in. I mean, surely 6 SEC teams can't get in. This would be absolute madness if this happens, though.
No, I don't see a path for 6 SEC teams to get in. I think you would have to have BYU lose at least 2 more. I think you would need Texas Tech to run the table and win the Big 12. Or you can have BYU run the table, win the Big 12, and then Texas Tech knocks out Utah because they have the head-to-head. So Big 12 gets 1 in. ACC right now, like we've talked about, I think in all likelihood the ACC is a 1-bid league. What you would need for additional SEC teams to get in would be for Pitt to beat Notre Dame, which is absolutely possible. Probably not likely, but possible. You also would need Oregon to drop 1 down the stretch, which is absolutely possible. Maybe not likely, but possible. Might need them to lose 2. If we're going to make it more clear cut for the SEC, that would remove Oregon. You would need Washington to beat Oregon, for example, in the final week of the regular season. But you would also need USC to lose to Oregon, and then USC to lose to Iowa or beat Iowa. You need just some carnage. You need a handful of 3-loss or underwhelming 2-loss Big Ten teams, which I think is going to be possible, if not probable. So yes, there is a possibility that the SEC could get a ton in. Ohio State, Indiana are locks. We know that, right? Like their locks were not even not really worth even debating at this point, barring some complete unforeseen blow up of one of those 2 teams. So you would need Oregon with 3, SC with 3, Iowa with 3, Michigan with 3. Michigan likely will have 3 because of the Ohio State game. Iowa, I think it's unlikely they run the table. I think SC is more capable of running the table than Iowa at this point. And then I think Oregon will lose one. I just don't know which one. So then you start to measure. All right, Texas with 2, Oklahoma with 2. Do you take a 3-loss Oklahoma team, given what they've exemplified throughout a ridiculous schedule, over a possible 2-loss team from the Big Ten that doesn't have as impressive of a schedule? That's something that we'll debate as well. But I think right now it's very, very safe to assume Big Ten at least 2, probably 3. SEC with at least 3, probably 4. All right. So 1 from the ACC, 1 from the Big 12, Notre Dame, and the G5 champ. But when you remove Notre Dame, it opens up the possibility of another SEC team. And if you remove Oregon from the equation, that opens up the possibility of another SEC team if there are some massive wins by SEC teams down the stretch, like Oklahoma, like Texas. And if Texas beats A&M, for example, A&M would have just 1 loss. It wouldn't affect their playoff candidacy. It would just affect Texas's at that point. So, yeah, I think the possibility of getting a bunch of SEC teams is really real. But just like we've learned in the SEC so far this year, man, chalk's not going to fly.
Exactly.
Like, I know we always assume it, but chalk's not going to fly. All right, guys, we asked for your tweets and you guys have responded. We are so grateful for the input that you guys have had in making the show awesome. So let's get into it. At Coach Barton 48, Memphis hasn't done enough to be in the top 25. I'm sorry. Just power teams is boring. I disagree with you on this one. I have a ton of respect for Memphis. I think they're an outstanding team. I think the G5 is very much up for grabs. I wouldn't be that surprised to see some chaos in the G5, by the way. But Memphis currently sits with the 120th ranked strength of schedule. And with all due respect to Memphis and what they've accomplished, they deserve immense credit. The win against Arkansas was outstanding. Arkansas currently sits at 2-7. So all that being said, Memphis has done a lot, but I cannot justify putting them in the top 25 with a schedule strength currently that is triple digits, when the teams they're being measured against are all sitting in the vicinity. The worst one, with the exception of Memphis, if they were to be ranked in the top 25, is Virginia, who has the 85th ranked strength of schedule. So we're talking about a gap of 35 spots on strength of schedule. And that was a Virginia team that was ranked at number 14. So I'm good with it. Totally support it. I don't have any problems with it whatsoever. We'll go next to Braden. Thoughts on BYU versus Ole Miss resume? BYU has the higher ranked win and no losses. Not entirely accurate. Ole Miss does have the win against number 12 Oklahoma, and BYU does have a really nice win against number 13 Utah. I think they're probably splitting hairs a bit here. I also think the committee, like we talked about, they factor in how you lose. And I know BYU hasn't lost, but they have looked less convincing in some of their wins. Their current game control, and this is a metric that I don't necessarily subscribe to, but a lot of people do. Ole Miss currently sits at 9 in game control. BYU is currently 14 in game control. That's basically a fancy way of saying eye test. So we'll see what happens. BYU's in perfect shape. They're just fine. They went out, home playoff game, no problem whatsoever. Next up is Jason Harrison. I like the rankings for the most part. Just can't buy Notre Dame getting the nod in front of Texas and Oklahoma. Totally fine. But like we talked about a little earlier in the show, Notre Dame has looked more convincing. If you look and you want to look at the prism of this past week, just the final week, this last week, week 10, that's all we're evaluating. I agree with you. Notre Dame played with their food and looked underwhelming against Boston College. But if you look at all their performances since losing to Texas A&M in week 3, they've looked a lot more convincing than what we've seen from Oklahoma, who's been a little up and down, and from Texas, who's been very up and down prior to bouncing back last week and looking very convincing for 3 quarters against the Vanderbilt Commodores. So I think Texas and Oklahoma are in great shape, but I also think that Notre Dame is appropriately ranked when looking at the consistency they've played with over the course of the last 8 games when compared to the inconsistency we've seen from Texas and Oklahoma. We'll go next to Rock and Rant. Hey, Greg, explain to me how Notre Dame is 8 spots ahead of Miami. Where's Notre Dame's big win other than SC, who ranks behind Miami? Miami is a higher rate than they do. Understandable. And if I'm Miami fan right now, I'm very frustrated. I am. I'm very frustrated because I think if you look at it, it's kind of unfortunate because there's really no at-large path for you. It's not your fault. You played one heck of a non-conference gauntlet. You played Florida. You played Florida State. You played against Notre Dame. You played South Florida, who's actually a very good football team. Miami's best win is against Notre Dame for sure. Their second best win is against USF. Notre Dame does have just one good win, and that's against number 19 SC. But if you look at the entire body of work, the way they've started to peak, the way they've had to deal with some injuries, at least early in the season, and the way they've started to kind of work themselves into shape, I think Notre Dame is good. I could make a case that Miami should be a touch higher. I could also make a case that Notre Dame could be a touch lower, but I can't make a really loud argument on either side, frankly. Like, Miami has been their own worst enemy. And if they had just taken care of business against SMU, we'd be having a completely different conversation. Had Miami beaten SMU, I would not be surprised if they were sitting ranked number 13. Instead, they're ranked number 18, and they dropped all the way out as a result of that performance. But right now, it's looking like the only path for the Canes right now is by winning the ACC championship game, knowing what currently sits in front of them. Let's go to Kerry Johnson. Indiana and Texas A&M deserve to be ahead of Ohio State right now. I don't have a huge problem with that. I just look at the level of dominance that we've seen from Ohio State, and I can get on board with the committee being on board with them being number one. You look at game control, you look at some of the metrics. They also went out of conference and played against a tough Texas team in the non-conference. I think they get extra credit for that. Now, Indiana has played nobody in the non-conference. They played Kennesaw State, Old Dominion, Indiana State. Is that potentially being held against them? Perhaps. They do have a good win on the road at Iowa. It wasn't pretty, but it was good. They also had a good win, a convincing win at Illinois, but Illinois is nowhere to be found in the top 25. Then, of course, their best moment of the week, best moment of the year came on the road at Oregon, but Oregon's currently sitting at number 9, whereas Texas is just 2 spots behind them, and Ohio State has that win against the Longhorns. So I'm okay with them being 1 and 2. Now look at A&M. As far as 4 quarters of dominant performance, we haven't gotten it as often from them as we have from Indiana and Ohio State. So I don't have a problem with the top 3. I can understand why some might, but to me, you're kind of splitting hairs, at least at this point, with A&M with still an awful lot to prove and a lot of schedule strength remaining on their record. Miller says, not bad, but Indiana should be 1. I can't necessarily push back on that. You tell me right now, who do I think is maybe the team that might be toughest to play against? They can make a really strong argument in favor of Indiana. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Really appreciate you guys being with us. We will do this every single Tuesday night. As soon as I get off the set of the rankings release show, I will be right here with y'all, answering your questions, answering your tweets, interacting with Mark and Jack, and talking ourselves kind of through this entire ranking that we get every single week. And don't let anybody tell you these rankings don't matter. This first ranking matters. The second ranking matters. You don't realize it yet, but where you are today could potentially have a significant fallout at the end of the season because you were misranked or maybe ranked too high or maybe ranked too low. So it does matter. And for anyone that tells you otherwise, they're not little. They haven't lived it like we've lived it the last couple of years. It can get chaotic and it can be problematic if you're boxed out right now and you're desperate for that at-large opportunity. So for all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. Go and subscribe to the podcast. Check us out on the ESPN College Football YouTube page. We'll be back again on Sunday to help break down and make sense of what should be an outstanding Week 11. Hope you have a wonderful day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.